here I am, a young theological student, have completed my first year, and I'm going into my second year. And a teacher who had a great influence on me. In fact, he is known as the father of Dalit theology. This particular teacher put up front and center, strongly influenced by liberation theology and black theology, the fact that the Indian church consisted primarily of people from the so-called untouchable backgrounds. But Indian Christian theology had sort of ignored that reality. And he said, for an authentic Indian theology, we need to put the theology of the marginalized, Dalit theology, D-A-L-I-T, up A-L-I-T. This is the chosen self-appellation of those from that background. So this teacher had started this process. I've done a lot of writing on that, and it's become a big thing in the Indian churches. India's distinctive contribution to the theology of liberation and the theology of the marginalized. But he left, and we didn't know who would come in his place. And a young person, fresh out of the University of Iowa, became my next theology teacher, Dr. Paul Rajashekar. I was in his very first batch. He realized that he was dealing with a group of students who thought they knew it all. That happens to first-year theology students. We've done a little of everything, and naturally we know everything. He was very, very good. He taught me Introduction to Indian Christian Theology. He taught me Life and Thought of Martin Luther. In fact, my first published paper started off as an essay I wrote for him in my class. So that's the first contact that I met Dr. Rajashekar and was his student. Okay, so that was in the early 1980s. I remember that when I was being evaluated during my final year, Dr. Rajashekar came and said, we've made sure to put in a clause which says you need to go out to the rural areas. That's one thing missing in you. And that was a very wise thing to do. I was apprehensive, as you can imagine, but the faculty decision to report to my diocese, my adjudicatory, that he needs to have rural exposure and rural ministry was a transformative point in my life. But then, as I told you, I was pastor for 2 years in a rural congregation. I became pastor for a further 2 years, this time as a presbyter. I was the associate of a very large urban congregation, a congregation which worshipped in my mother tongue, which is Kannada. And then I was invited to join the faculty of the United Theological College as a junior lecturer. I only had my Bachelor of Science and my Bachelor of Divinity, but they must have seen something which I didn't realize. So straight out of parish, they appointed me as a junior lecturer. Dr. Rajashekar by that time had left the United Theological College and had gone on to his subsequent career in the ecumenical movement at the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva. I joined the seminary. I then went on to do my master's. Even while I had a position at the seminary, I was sent to an Orthodox seminary to live in a monastery to study the early church. That's where I learned Syriac. I got caught up in the regular monastic life of the community. I did all the prostrations, the food restrictions that the Orthodox would do. I had one of the finest scholars of the early church as my thesis guide, Father Dr. V.C. Samuel, whose work on the Council of Chalcedon, done at Yale University in the 1950s, is the classic in its field, looking at the Council of Chalcedon from the point of view of the non-Chalcedonian churches. I have to add a personal note here. we got married while I was a pastor, and our first year was serving this very large urban congregation. And the first week of our wedding, my new wife and I, we were at a cemetery, and people said, "Why are you taking your bride to a cemetery?" Well, this church, we had literally dozens of deaths during a year. And Mrinalini got involved in the pastoral life of the congregation as a young bride very early on. We had a very little moped, a mofa kind of thing. Looking back, I wonder how two people fitted on that one seat. But since this congregation was so large and people were scattered all over Bangalore, every evening we went house visiting. We covered at least 8 to 12 houses, if not more, every day, because that's the only way we could have visited all 700, 800 families. So I was married. We had been appointed, much to my surprise, to the seminary. And then I told you I went for my master's to a monastery. And that's the key. At a monastery, women were not allowed. So Mrinalini stayed with my parents, and our son was born 3 days after I joined the monastery for the master's program. So for 2 years, I was at the monastery doing my master's, and she was with my parents. I did travel to Bangalore once a month, but that was a period of separation. Then I went back to the seminary, this time not as a junior lecturer, since I had my Master of Theology 2-year program, but as a lecturer. And the year following, we went to Germany with our son, who was by now approaching his 5th birthday. And we both studied German first and then enrolled at the University of Hamburg, where I did my doctorate in theology, and Mrinalini did her doctorate in literature. But how does all this connect to how I got here? We get back to India, and I rejoined the seminary. After a year, I became an associate professor. 5 years after that, I became full professor in 2003. I was serving as the chair of the Department of Theology and Ethics. I had served as the dean of the doctoral program. My writings had fallen into several categories. I had published my dissertation on the baptismal controversy in the work of Cyprian of Carthage, so I had a number of articles on the early church. I had another set of articles on mission, conversion, baptism in the Indian context. I had another set of articles on Dalit theology, using basically my experiences as a pastor, my very first pastorate in the villages of India. So I had done this range and spectrum of writings in various areas. I had visited the United States for the very first time in 1995. And here's a very interesting link, because in 1995, I came to this campus. And it's very interesting as to why I came here. When we were in Germany, I was at a place called the Academy of Mission, the Missions Academy of the University of Hamburg. This was something set up after the Second World War, intentionally by the German churches, in order to enrich the world view of German churches and German universities. So what did they do? They brought in students from Africa, from Asia, from Latin and Central America, all of whom would come, do a program, most often a doctoral degree, and return to their home countries. So I was with students from Zaire, now Congo, from Peru, from Brazil, from the Philippines, from Korea. We had students from China. I had classmates from all these places, from Zimbabwe, and all of us were studying at the University of Hamburg in different areas. One of the persons who was of primary guidance to us was the director of the Academy of Mission. And he, as a young white German in the early 1960s, had been sent by the German churches to the US, to the South, to Georgia, and he actually marched in the civil rights movement. Deeply, he wrote his dissertation on aspects of that, went back to Germany and took this whole thing with him. And he taught several courses about African American theology, African American reality. There was some money available for this whole group for a globalization seminar, and we told him, you've been teaching all this, why can't you organize a trip to the places that you know and love and have been influenced by? And he organized a 2-week trip for this huge group of people from all over the world to 2 places, Atlanta and New Orleans. We were plunged into the reality of African American worship, African American life. We went into plantations, the history of slavery. We went to the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. For 2 weeks, we were plunged into the life of the African American churches and the African American reality and experience in the United States. So that was my first experience of the United States. Following those 2 weeks, some of us who had other contacts were traveling for another 2 weeks in the US. And I was with a classmate whom you know, Dr. John Samuel Raj, who has been a visiting professor at this seminary and is now the principal of the United Theological College in Bangalore. We were visiting friends of ours who were studying at Princeton. And our common teacher was Dr. Paul Rajashekar, who invited us to come and visit him. So we drove down with another friend who at that time was studying at Westminster Theological Seminary. He brought us from Princeton. We came to this campus, visited Dr. James Vijaya Kumar, who was at that time a visiting professor here, who then took us to the home of Dr. Paul Rajashekar. That's it, 1995. The longer American experience that I had came during my sabbatical in 2003-2004, when I became a member of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton, New Jersey. This is a remarkable program which has brought scholars, academicians from all over the world to spend 9 months, 1 year in Princeton with access to Princeton Seminary and Princeton University libraries. We had our offices, we had a townhouse. Mrinalini, Neeraj and Sagarika, our children, visited me twice during this program, for Christmas 2003 and then just before I went back in May 2004. For them, that was the first time they had been in the United States. It's very interesting. I did meet Dr. Wilson, I did meet Dr. Rajashekar, but I didn't come to this seminary. I was doing my work at Princeton. We met on other occasions, but I didn't even come down to Philadelphia at that time. Well, I completed my sabbatical, went back to India, continued my work as a professor at the seminary, and there was an inquiry one day from Dean Rajashekar saying Dr. Henry Wilson has decided to move on, and a targeted search had identified me as a potential person to take this position. Was I surprised? That's putting it mildly. Was I excited? I'm not sure. I was in a position, I was very comfortable with where I was. I realized that this would be a disruption in my wife's career. But on the other hand, when I realized that something had been set in motion without my direct interest or application, I was intrigued. I have mentioned Dr. Rajshekhar's name, but that was as a teacher-student. A collegial interaction had never really been there up to that point. I still called him Sir. And I remember I wrote back to him and said, "Dear Sir," S-I-R, thank you for, that's what Indian students call their teachers. Some of my students who then became my colleagues found it very difficult to give up calling me Sir. They moved to Dr. Kiran. So I remember writing, "Dear Sir, thank you for your letter. We are intrigued," and things like that. But then one thing led to the other, and I was asked to come here in 2006. I was asked to give a lecture. I was asked to meet students. I was asked to talk to faculty. I went through the whole process, at the end of which a firm offer was made to me to take up this position. So, surprise. The one thing that gave me solace was it wouldn't be a break, because this seminary and the United Theological College have a formal relationship. You know that Dr. Bob Robinson, Dr. Phil Cray have been visiting professors in Bangalore. And from Bangalore, we've had a number of people who have come. And we've had students who have come from the Indian theological system to this seminary. In fact, coming here, I had to give up my doctoral student, Samuel George. But then as part of this agreement and as part of this relationship, we brought him here for 4 months to use the library. And just day before yesterday, we got the delightful news that Samuel George, who went back and completed his doctorate, has now become the principal of a regional seminary in India. And LTSP can be proud of the fact that they have helped in the theological formation of yet another person who will contribute to the church and theological education in India. So I realized that this was not a clean break. This would enhance the relationship that we had. And Dean Rajshekhar and I went back in 2010, taking a group of students from here on a globalization seminar, beginning at the United Theological College in Bangalore.